Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Gott hat das Evangelium, which translates to God has the gospel. A couple of interesting quirks in this chorale, but really not too much to write home about. All the harmony is fairly straightforward. We're just going to hop right into it. So one sharp in the key signature. We start on E minor, and we end on B major, which is pretty interesting. Something that's been happening a lot in some recent chorales, proportionate to really the trend of all of the chorales that we've analyzed up until this point. We expect perfect authentic cadences at the end of the chorale. It's a little spoiler alert if you're following this along in a linear fashion, but I think the overall tonality of this chorale is E minor, and after our initial tonic triad we have B, D sharp, B, and F sharp, which is B major over D sharp. That's 5/6. I should also mention that our first cadence is a perfect authentic cadence in the key of G major. So there is a point in which we modulate to the key of G major, and I think it happens right here, E, E, G, and B, which is another E minor chord, which I think becomes 6 in the key of G major. Of course, this is a modulation zone, so there are multiple points in which you could say the modulation occurs, but it feels like this is the point where I hear it happens. But after this passing tone in the melody, we get F sharp, D, A, and F sharp, which is D major over F sharp, D, D major over F sharp, which is 5/6, our dominant, passing 7th in the melody, and then we get G, D, A, and B. This A has a 9/8 suspension over the bass, making this a G major chord, which is our tonic. And then we get C, E, G, and A, which is A minor 7 over C. We know that Bach loves 2/6/5 chords, especially in cadential situations. This F sharp is a non-chord tone, this E is a chord tone, and then we would expect a 5 chord afterwards, which we get D, D, F sharp, and this B right here is an accented non-chord tone. Really what we're looking for is A and C. This is a 5/7 chord if that's the case, D7 in root position, and then we cadence on G major. G, B, D, and G. Tonic triad, root position. Next phrase ends with an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of E minor. I think we just start off in the key of E minor. This G major chord here, G, D, G, and B is our tonic triad. There's also an argument here with this passing tone that it could be an E minor chord in first inversion, but when I hear it, it sounds like a G major chord because it's at the end of a phrase and it's its own idea, and the first thing you hear is the G major chord. So I think this is now 3 in the key of E minor. Again, this is a bit of a zone. Actually, really, is there much of a zone? I feel like we've modulated by the time we've heard this D sharp, so to me, it's our 3 chord. We then have D sharp, F sharp, A, and B. 3 going to 5 is not the most common progression, but we do see it with some frequency, so this isn't unprecedented for any particular reason. 3 really is sort of functioning as a substitute for 1 in this case, because the tones are so similar, D versus E. And then afterwards we would expect a tonic triad, E, E, G, and B. E minor in root position. Passing tone in the melody here before we get B, D, F sharp, and D. Now let me go ahead and check and see if this is a D natural. It is in fact a D natural. We have a minor dominant here in the wild. That's something that's kind of interesting about this particular chorale. And the D is something that Bach is incorporating himself. It is being doubled here in the melody here, which is melody 2, which is also really fascinating. Typically speaking, my original hypothesis, typically speaking, is that Bach, minor dominance would occur when the D natural occurs in the melody, and that's often the case when Bach supports the harmony or supports with other voices that create a minor dominant. D is usually in the melody, or the third of the chord is in the melody. In this case it's D, it's not always going to be D, but the fact that it's doubled is very fascinating as well. Don't really know why that is, but it's pretty cool that Bach is doing that. And we see minor dominance from time to time as well in the chorales where Bach uses a third that he's inputted himself. So after our 5 chord, we go right back to 1, E, E, G, and B, tonic triad, root position, passing 7th in the bass, before we get C sharp, E, G, and A. A7 over C sharp, not a secondary dominant or anything. This is a harmonization of melodic minor. We can see melodic minor here in the bass. It's a 4-6-5 chord. And then we get D sharp, B, F sharp, and B, which is B major over D sharp. That's our 5 chord in first inversion. And then we cadence on E minor, E, B, E, and G, which is our tonic triad in root position. Next phrase, we get kind of an interesting cadence. We cadence in the key of E minor, so no modulation from this point forward, but it's a deceptive cadence. It's always fascinating when we see one of those. We start the phrase off with another E minor, E, E, G, and B. No need to reanalyze. And then we get E, E, G, and C. This is a pretty cool chord. We keep all the same tones, and we keep this C here, which turns it into C major over E, which is 6-6. And then when we look off of the harmonic rhythm, which sort of looks like the whole point of this gesture is that really it's what's happening on the and of the beat that matters here. The F sharp, the D, the A, and carrying over the C from before. That's D major in, D7 over F sharp, which is 7-6-5 in the key of E minor. I think there's an argument to be made that maybe we briefly shift to the key of G major here. I mean, the melody really outlines it, that's for sure, but I feel like just a 3 chord fragment doesn't quite cut it for me in terms of having the effect of a modulation, especially with melodic minor right on the other side of it. I think really we just have sort of a cycle of falling fifths progression here where we have G major following the 7 chord. Sometimes people analyze this as 5-6-5 of 3, and I typically do secondary dominants. At least I've been doing this for a couple of months now where I stack them atop one another. But in the case of like this lower analysis where there's a second or an alternative way you could analyze the harmony, writing them side by side lends itself to be a little bit easier to visualize spaced out so it doesn't create too much of a stack. But 7-6-5 of 5, or sorry, 7-6-5 or 5-6-5 of 3. I've seen some people analyze 7 chords as 5 of 3 just because they feel like leading tone chords are more common and appropriate as far as like retaining the label of the 7 chord in a minor key, but I think both of them are used, and it doesn't really matter which way you analyze. In this case, 7 still wants to go to 3, so I find the second analysis a little redundant, but I offer it because I see some people analyze it that way. Actually, the book that I first started learning theory with taught me to analyze it that way, and I've seen it used a couple of other times. But 7 does go to 3, G, D, A, and B. This A is a 9/8 suspension over the G. We saw something like this earlier as well. Maybe an argument for the fact that we are in the key of G major, but all in all it could just be Bach's relationship with G major chords. We then have C sharp, E, G, and A again. Harkening back to our previous phrase, this is A7 over C sharp, 4-6-5. Then we get D sharp, B, and F sharp as well, making this a B7 over D sharp chord, which is 5-6-5 here. Before we go to E minor, E, B, E, and G, tonic triad, root position. More passing tones in the outer voices before we get G, B, E, and B, which is our tonic triad in first inversion. This A is a non-chord tone. This D sharp is a non-chord tone. This C sharp is a non-chord tone. And then we get B, B, D sharp carried over from the previous beat, and F sharp, which is our 5 chord in root position. This B here is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. This A is a little delayed passing tone, and then we cadence on C major. This is a deceptive cadence. It's our 6 chord. Okay, so we run into another conundrum here, which sort of echoes what's happening at the beginning of the phrase that we just analyzed, and that is, I think that we have a brief modulation to the key of G major, at least for the first half of this phrase. It's what it sounds like to me. It might be harder to justify than just keeping it in the key of E minor, but I'm going to analyze it in the key of G major, just because of the fact that it feels a little bit more natural for me to do so. So we start off with some secondary dominants. We have B, D, G sharp, and B, which is G sharp diminished over B. That would be 7/6 of 4, because G sharp is the leading tone to A, and A is our subdominant in the key of E minor. And then we go to A minor, A, E, A, and C, which is our 4 chord. And herein lies an interesting conundrum that I've seen a couple of times in Bach's chorales, and I've been calling it 2/7 morphing in my notes. 2/7 morphing is the code that I've been using for describing when this occurs in the chorales. So just looking at it superficially here, in the key of G major, A minor is also our 2 chord, no problem. But if we look at the grand scheme of what's happening here, 2 typically does not go to 1. Just generally speaking, 2 does not go to 1 in Bach's harmonic vocabulary. We see it sometimes, but it's very, very rare. And typically speaking, there is something lingering under the surface that makes it a little bit ambiguous. It's not just a 2 chord and then a 1 chord. You can see that other voices are moving. And I think another way to analyze this, and even though I'm going to call it a passing tone, I really do feel like this F sharp is our root here, and it's actually F sharp diminished over A. F sharp, A, and C. But saying that an A chord is an A minor chord and F sharp diminished, it is the pivot to the next key is, I don't know, I think that it might be a little over analyzed, because I feel effectively what's happening here is that there's not really a chord progression happening over the span of this beat. It's not subdivided, because for me it feels, I feel like at least 2 voices need to be moving in order for a chord progression to be implied. But when one voice moves, it has the potential to change the context of the chord. Like in this case, we have a minor chord turning into a diminished chord just by that stepwise motion. And for me, I feel like 2 is turning into 7 by the time we see G major on the other side, and 7/6 going to 1/6 in this direction is very common. So it feels like that's a better justification of what's happening here, rather than just saying 2 going to 1. Of course, if you didn't have the same reservations that I do, you could say 2 going to 7 going to 1. That's totally fine as well. I'd see where you were coming from. But here, this is just what it feels like to me. 2 has the potential to be recontextualized as 7. So I wouldn't call this a straightforward, or as straightforward in the sense that it's just 1 chord following the next 2 to 1 progression. There's a 7 chord lurking in there. That leading tone is always creating a sense of dominance, and I feel like it overrides the E. For all we know, this could be a big 7/6/5 chord, and this E could be the 7th of our F sharp minor 7 flat 5. But that was enough talk about that. We go to E minor over oh, apologies, that's not an E minor chord. This is a G major chord. We're in the key of G major. I completely forgot we're in the key of G major. This is G major over B, which is 1/6. B, G, D, and B. And then we have some passing tones in the alto and the bass here. And if you take the aggregate, we have C, E, G, and B again, which is a 4/7 chord, and I feel like that's significant because it's a predominant chord, typically speaking. Not always, but typically speaking, and 4/7 is preceding a dominant D, D, F sharp, and A, which is our 5 chord. So a bit of a subdivided or passing progression here. We have a passing 7th in the tenor as well before we get E, B, E, and G. So we have a deceptive progression at the end of this, which sort of makes me feel like, have we really modulated at all? Could we have analyzed this in the key of E minor? I think we could have. But all in all, it sounds G major-like to me. It sounds more extensive than what was happening at the beginning of this phrase, and this just feels like another take on really what's going on melodically, because all in all, if you look at what's happening melodically, this phrase is a repeat of the same material we saw in the previous phrase. So all in all, feels like G major this time around. If this were just the melody, it would sound like G major the previous time before as well, but the bass and these inner voices really have an effect on the context. But 6 is going to be recontextualized as 1 in the key of E minor, passing tone in the melody, G, B, E, and B. That's just E minor in first inversion, so we don't need to reiterate the Roman numeral there. Passing tone in the bass, and as we're getting ready for a perfect authentic cadence here in the key of E minor, we have B, B, D sharp, and F sharp. That's a 5 chord, B major, a little delayed passing 7th here in the tenor, and then we cadence on E minor, E, G, E, and E. 3 roots and 1/3, or I guess technically 2 roots and 1/3, because the melody and the alto are doubled. It's the same pitch that they're singing, but doesn't really make too much of an impact. Okay, next phrase we have an ending with a half cadence. More specifically, you might be ahead of me here, a Phrygian half cadence, which is the first time in a chorale that I've analyzed that a chorale ends in a Phrygian half cadence. It very well might be the only chorale that ends with a Phrygian half cadence. Either I didn't acknowledge it when it happened before, or this is the first one, and maybe the only one. It's very uncommon. But regardless, we're still in the key of E minor here. Beginning of this phrase, a little interesting as well. D sharp, B, F sharp, and B. This chord is the same, which is why I skipped it. We don't need to reanalyze that. This is B major over D sharp. It's 5/6. And we have some neighbor tones here, which give us a bit of context. We have C sharp, and we have E, and we have B's being doubled here in the tenor and the melody. There's a little bit of a reference to C sharp minor 7 flat 5 here, which is the result of melodic minor being harmonized. If you take a 6 chord, which is major, typically in like a diatonic minor scale, and you raise the 6th scale degree, the minor chord turns into a diminished chord, right? Because you're just raising the root by a half step. But we have no 5th in this chord, and I feel like that's just as important as the root is in terms of giving the chord its identity. It's probably second to the root of the chord, but not by far in terms of important tones. So I'm not going to mark the tone or the chords here, but it sort of feels like there's a little bit of a 6 or maybe a 4 chord without a root here. But afterwards we get D sharp, F sharp, F sharp, and A. And here's the thing that's interesting, because oh no, apologies. I'm getting back into the old mindset I had when I was analyzing the first time. When you take into context the entire beat, we have B, F sharp, D sharp, and A. So I feel like instead of calling this a 7 chord, which I think, it would be a valid analysis, D sharp diminished in root position, I think really the big picture here is that we're just taking a 5/6 chord and adding a 7th. That's really all. Or we're taking our 5 chord and just turning it into a 7 chord here, because when you take everything across the whole beat, it's just all chord tones, so sometimes that happens. But all in all, not a big deal whether you analyze it as 7 or 5/7. Really, the idea of what's going on here is just a big dominant gesture proportionate to the rest of the phrase. And then we get E minor for just as long. There's like some symmetry. 5, 5, 1, 1, E, E, B, and G. Tonic triad, root position, passing tones in the melody and the tenor. E, G, B, and E. Would you see some exchange going on here between the voices? They just are singing the pitches that the previous voice was singing. So it's still E minor. We don't need to reanalyze. Passing tones in the same voices as before. Then we have E, B, E, and G again. No need to reanalyze. 3 beats devoted to E minor. That's pretty cool. Passing tone in the bass, and another beat devoted to E minor, but we finally get a change of bass. G, B, E, and G. 1/6. E is actually taking that chord and putting it in root position briefly, so it's a chord tone. It's something I've been keeping track of for a while now, and that's just something for my own notes, but I don't really feel like it's really making a huge impact on the chord progression, but it's interesting when the bass changes and we still have an intact chord. That is to say that the bass being changed did not change the completeness of the chord. It's not like the chord was lacking a third or lacking a fifth when the bass changed. That's something that I've been tracking in my just for my own research. It's not super integral that makes it into your own analysis, but it doesn't hurt. It's accurate. But as we're closing in on our Phrygian half cadence, we have a bit of an interesting chord progression here. We have C, C, E, and A. It's A minor over C, which is 4/6. B, E, and E is actually a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. G is a 7th. It's kind of interesting here with this B, E, and G. It's kind of like we have a 1/6/4 chord in passing, separating the two chordal ideas. But yeah, really, we can talk about what's happening here. It might be an implied tonic chord to separate the 4 and the next chord, but all in all, it isn't a complete chord because we have this A suspended here, and that impacts what makes it onto the page for me. But afterwards, we get C, D sharp, F, and A, which is 7/4/2, right? Am I crazy here? Yeah, it's like a 7/4/2 chord, which is kind of interesting. D sharp diminished over C. 7/4/2. Oh, of nothing. Sorry, I was expecting it to be like 7/4/2 of 5 or something. But no, this is 7/4/2. And typically speaking, we would expect this to go to a 3/6 chord, but it's not. It's going to a 5 chord in root position. So the roots aren't a fifth away. So this is kind of an unusual resolution. It's kind of interesting to see a 7/4/2 chord as well in the context of a, you know what, I'm going to walk that back. Apologies. I think that it is possible to call this a 7/4/2 chord, but what I think is more likely is that this F sharp and this D sharp are just enclosing the same way that this C sharp and this E are enclosing the tones that are contextual here, and really what's happening is that this is just a continuation of the 4/6 chord with C, E, E, where the alto and the tenor are actually singing the same note, and A. In the melody, whenever you have a Phrygian half cadence, there's like always a 4/6 chord lurking. It's like you can always find a way to pull it out of the texture. It's always 4/6 as the chord, like there's no denying the fact that it's a 4/6 chord, or it's a contrapuntal texture and 4/6 is sort of the chord that's being implied amongst all of the inner workings and like weavings of what's going on pitch-wise. So I'm going to say this is a continuation of 4/6 to fit the narrative that I would expect, and it's there. You don't have to look too hard for it, but seeing a 7/4/2 chord in there is pretty interesting. That's rare. Typically the chord that you would expect to see is like a 2/4/3, but here we see 7/4/2, and that makes sense because you're just rotating the pitches just one extra step each time. But without any further ado, we end the chorale on 5, B, D sharp, F sharp, and B, which is our 5 chord root position. Typically half cadences end with the 5th of the chord in the melody, but at the end of the chorale, perhaps it sort of fits the narrative of the perfect authentic cadence, maybe the perfect half cadence in the sense that the root of the chord is in the melody, but regardless, it's not super important to talk about. But yeah, that's today's chorale. I mean, the big takeaways here are the mid-phrase modulation at the beginning, which is kind of interesting. The fact that we start in one key and we end the phrase in a different key than the one we started with. That's pretty cool. Then we have a minor dominant, which is relatively rare in the chorales. You know, it's like we don't see them all that often, but here we are seeing one in a very clear context. There's really not much to... wait, I missed a passing tone right here. Apologies. But yeah, I was probably talking about the minor dominant and missed it. But yeah, it's pretty clear here. The lower voices are static and they're pretty much spelling the chord on their own, so it's pretty interesting. the idea of the 2-7 morph. This is more so about my relationship with the harmony, but I feel like even though A minor is being used as the device to move to G major here, really it's the F sharp diminished chord that pulls us to the tonic, right? It's not really a 2-7 progression because it's just one voice moving, but rather the fact that a single voice, a single line of D going to G is sort of carrying the overall harmony of the chorale. So there's this morph, this change of context that happens when one voice switches from one note to the next, and the rest of the voices can stay static. And of course, the fact that we end in a half cadence, or even more specifically a Phrygian half cadence, that's pretty neat as well. But I'm going to end the video on that note. I already talked as much about the topics at hand that I wanted to talk about. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You can hit the notification icon as well if you're interested in following me along on the journey, and like the video if you enjoyed the content. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.